In your new book, Second Estate, you explain why the focus of the political debate on tax rates is misleading, in fact, willfully misleading, and why we should focus instead on taxable income. Can you explain this to our listeners?
Absolutely. So much of the conversation around taxes has been about the fact that top tax rates have come down significantly since, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Although that is in fact true, raising tax rates would do nothing to actually curb the problem of our wealthiest Americans avoiding taxes. And that's because the way the wealthiest Americans are able to avoid taxes is they avoid taxable income, so they don't have income taxes, and they avoid the estate tax, so they don't pay estate taxes. So proposals to raise tax rates would do nothing to bring them into the system.
You had a really example that actually shocked me that you spoke about elsewhere, I think at the New York Public Library, and it was about Warren Buffett's famous op-ed calling for everyone to pay higher taxes and pointing out that the differential between his tax rate and his secretary's tax rate. And you pointed out that that argument was actually incredibly disingenuous. And I was shocked by this. So can you just back up and explain this, because I think it really does illuminate your argument in just crystal clear terms.
Yes. So Warren Buffett published an op-ed called It's Time to Soak the Rich or something like that. And he complained about the fact that his secretary paid taxes at a higher tax rate than he did. And so far, that much is true. His secretary paid taxes anybody who works for a living. She paid taxes on her income, so at rates as high as 37% today, and she paid additional payroll taxes at 15.3%. And as Warren Buffett said, he himself had capital gains. Capital gains were taxed at like 20%. And so, therefore, this system is unfair. However, what he left out of the story is that he himself would have paid hardly any more taxes at all under the Buffett rule, because although he did recognize some capital gains, his biggest tax avoidance was the fact that he didn't have to pay any taxes at all on the enormous growth of his wealth. And that's because, first of all, we don't tax gains. But second of all, the way he operated Berkshire Hathaway is to never distribute dividends. And he actually tells quite a funny story about how there was only one time that Berkshire Hathaway issued dividends. And as he said, he must have been in the bathroom at the time because he was very opposed to paying dividends. And of course, dividends for much of the country's history were taxed at the highest ordinary income rates. So by not issuing dividends, they didn't have to pay taxes. So stock prior to 1982, companies were not allowed to buy back their own stocks because it was seen as market manipulation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was a rule that was put in place by Reagan. Reagan put in place for the very first time, the chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission was somebody who had worked for E.F. Hutton. And he said, let's allow stock buybacks, even though we never have before, because they were seen as a form of market manipulation. So, and there's been a massive shift away from dividends. So in the 1970s, like 70% of returns were in the form of dividends. And now I think since this change of rule in 1982, I don't think it's ever been more than like 17% of returns are in dividends. So we have the case of the disappearing dividends. When we look at being taxed on investments, right? Back in the day when investments were shared in dividends, the federal government got a tax, collected a tax when the dividends were distributed. Now, when these stock buybacks are occurring and we have the pension funds are happy to sell because they don't pay taxes, but the taxable investors, they don't sell and they just have the boosting values of their stock. And so who is one of the main victims of this, from my point of view, is the federal government, which no longer is collecting tax revenue on the distribution of corporate profits.
But what I find fascinating in your book is that there was a time not that long ago, at least for people who are a little bit older, where wealthy Americans were paying taxes. So what happened that exempted the rich from paying taxes?
Right. So one of them is one we've already discussed, right? So if people had a lot of stock and they got a lot of dividends, dividends were taxed as ordinary income, meaning at the same rate as compensation income. So if a company shared its profits in the form of dividends, holders of stock had a lot of taxable income. So that was one thing. But the bigger problem has occurred in connection with inheritances. So we have a system where the income tax backs off of taxing inheritances because we have an assumption that we have this sort of robust estate tax that's doing its job and imposing taxes at what was at one time quite a significant rate. But what has happened is that beginning in the 1990s, there was an assault on the estate tax, and few people realize that while it stands in form, it has been entirely eviscerated and is no longer serving its function. So we have an income tax, right, that backs off of taxing inheritances and gives all sorts of benefits to inherited wealth on the assumption that we have this burdensome estate tax, but the estate tax stands in name only and is providing cover for the rich, but not actually imposing taxes.